In 21 days, I was in Kailash, trekked. My muscle mass had gone down, my legs had become like this. Always I've been walking, trekking, playing games, but my muscle mass went down so much in these 8 weeks, I just shrank like that.
3 days ago, in a monastery clinging to a ridge above the Burkha plain, a monk named Lobsang Dorje broke a vow of silence he had kept for 41 years. He did not do it for an audience. He did it because he believed, at 91 years old, that if he carried the story to his grave, no one would ever be warned again. What he told the two travelers who had sheltered in his monastery during a storm was not a legend. It was, he insisted, a memory passed down through 17 generations of caretakers, men and women whose only duty was to watch a mountain that watches back. This is that story, as it was told, reassembled, and imagined here as fiction. Whether you believe a word of it is entirely up to you. But by the end, you may find yourself looking at maps of western Tibet a little differently. Lobsang was young when his teacher first took him to the edge of the Kailash Valley and told him never to walk past a particular cairn of stones without permission. He remembers asking why. His teacher didn't answer with words. He simply pointed at the mountain and said, "It is not sleeping." For decades, Lobsang assumed this was metaphor, the kind of poetic caution old monks like to wrap around ordinary danger, the way parents tell children that lakes have spirits so they won't drown. It wasn't until he was assigned as a keeper of the monastery's inner archive, a small stone room behind a door that had not been opened in 3 generations, that he began to understand his teacher meant it literally. Inside that room were not sacred texts in the way most people imagine them. There were ledgers, actual counting ledgers, page after page, written in at least 4 different hands across 4 different centuries, recording something that had nothing to do with prayer. They recorded departures, names of travelers who approached the mountain's inner slopes, the date they left the outer camp, and, where known, the date and condition in which they returned, if they returned at all. Lobsang says the ledgers do not read like scripture. They read like the logbook of a harbor master tracking ships into a storm. According to Lobsang's account, the earliest entries date back further than any conventional record of pilgrimage in the region, long before the paths were formalized, before permits, before the mountain became a name on tourist itineraries. The pattern in the ledgers, he says, is consistent across centuries. The vast majority of pilgrims who kept to the outer circuit, the traditional 52-kilometer walking path that circles the mountain rather than climbing it, return home unremarkable, if changed in some quiet spiritual way that pilgrims often describe. But scattered throughout the ledgers, perhaps one entry in every few hundred, are notations beside a name that simply read, in old Tibetan script, did not come back the same. No further explanation. No diagnosis. Just that phrase, repeated across 1,000 years, in different ink, by different hands, as if each keeper independently arrived at the same words because no better ones existed. Lobsang describes flipping through pages as a young monk and feeling a chill he couldn't explain. Not fear of ghosts, he says, but the colder feeling of recognizing a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Different eras, different languages, different keepers who never met each other across centuries, and yet the same 3 words kept appearing next to the same rare, specific circumstance. Someone had left the marked path and gone toward the mountain's northern face. The most detailed account in Lobsang's version of events doesn't come from ancient scripture at all. It comes from within his own lifetime. In 1987, he says, a small geological survey team was granted rare permission to study rock formations along Kailash's lower northern slope, an area normally left completely undisturbed out of religious respect. The team consisted of 4 researchers and 2 local guides. Lobsang, then a younger monk assigned to observe on behalf of the monastery, was present at the base camp. He recalls the team as unremarkable at first, tired scientists more interested in stratigraphy than mysticism, mildly annoyed at having to coordinate with monastery elders before their work. They set out at dawn, expecting to return by early afternoon. 6 hours later, only 5 of them came back. The missing member, a young structural geologist, was found 2 days later by a search party, sitting cross-legged less than 400 meters from where the group had last seen him, close enough that Lobsang says it made no logical sense he hadn't simply been spotted immediately. He was alive but would not speak coherently for nearly a week. When he finally did, he insisted only a few minutes had passed between losing sight of his colleagues and being found. His watch and every other clock and instrument the team carried told a different story. The search had taken more than 40 hours. What struck Lobsang most, listening to travelers and mountaineers pass through his monastery over the decades, was not stories of disaster. It was the far stranger, quieter pattern of people who simply changed their minds. He recounts an encounter with a hardened alpine climber in the early 2000s, a man who had summited peaks across 3 continents and spoke of Kailash's northern face with the practical confidence of someone assessing a route, not a myth. He arrived determined, equipped, experienced. Lobsang served him tea and expected to say goodbye the next morning as the man set off. Instead, the climber appeared at the monastery gate before dawn, pale, his gear already packed onto his porters, asking only for directions back toward the nearest town. When Lobsang asked what had changed, the man reportedly said very little, only that he had walked to the edge of the outer circuit the previous evening to look at the route in the fading light, and that something about standing there had made the entire plan feel, in his words, obviously stupidly wrong, in a way he couldn't rationally justify to himself, let alone to Lobsang. He left without further explanation and, as far as the monastery knows, never attempted the mountain again. Lobsang says this story is common, not the exception, but close to the rule. Governments have, in fact, never issued a summit permit for Kailash, out of genuine, long-standing respect for its sacred status among four major religious traditions. But Lobsang's account adds a stranger footnote. He claims that even in the rare instances when foreign expeditions were unofficially tolerated by local authorities decades ago, before formal restrictions existed, almost none of them ever actually attempted a serious summit push, not because they were stopped, but because something at the mountain's base consistently, quietly, talked them out of it. By far the strangest thread in Lobsang's account concerns equipment. He is not a scientist, and he says so plainly, but he has watched enough travelers pass through with modern gear to notice a pattern that predates modern gear entirely. Long before compasses existed as most of the world understands them, Tibetan and Nepali guides in the region are said to have relied on landmark memorization rather than magnetic instruments specifically because, according to oral tradition passed to Lobsang by his own teacher, magnetized needles were known to behave erratically near the mountain's base, spinning without settling or drifting steadily off true north for no discernible reason. Lobsang has no scientific explanation for this and offers none. He simply notes that modern trekkers occasionally mention the same thing to him, almost as an aside, assuming it's a known quirk of the region rather than anything worth investigating further. He recalls, with a slight smile, a group of documentary filmmakers who visited roughly a decade ago, hoping to fly a small camera drone along the base of the northern face to capture footage no crew had gotten before. The drone lost its signal less than 2 kilometers in and was never recovered. The crew, Lobsang says, treated it as a simple technical malfunction, batteries, altitude, cold, and left within the week without much further comment. He doesn't dispute their explanation. He only notes quietly that it was the 4th drone lost in that same general area over the years, a fact the crew did not know because no one had told them, and no one thought to ask. No account of Kailash, fictional or otherwise, is complete without its 2 neighboring lakes, and Lobsang's telling lingers on them longest. Lake Manasarovar, freshwater and famously still, sits beside Rakshastal, saline and restless, separated by only a narrow spit of land. Their contrast is real, geographically documented, and genuinely striking to witness in person. One lake calm as glass even in wind, the other perpetually choppy even in stillness. In Lobsang's retelling, the lakes are described by his tradition not as 2 separate bodies of water, but as a single system, understood by pilgrims for centuries as representing opposing principles, light and shadow, order and chaos, the visible and the hidden, arranged deliberately on either side of the mountain like the 2 sides of a scale. Whether this reflects genuine ancient belief or Lobsang's own embellishment after a lifetime of guarding the story, even he admits he can no longer fully separate the 2 strands in his own memory. That admission, oddly, is what makes his account feel more honest than most. He describes walking between the 2 lakes at dusk as a young monk and experiencing what he calls a hell-breath feeling, not fear exactly, but the sense of standing in a doorway between 2 rooms, aware that stepping fully into either one would mean something. He has never been able to explain the feeling to his own satisfaction, and he doesn't pretend to now. The final piece of Lobsang's confession is also the one he offers with the least certainty and the most visible reluctance. Buried in the oldest and most damaged pages of the monastery's ledgers, in handwriting so faded it can barely be read even under good light, is a recurring reference to something the old keepers called, in a phrase that resists clean translation, roughly the room beneath the roots, a space said to lie deep within the mountain itself, sealed, undisturbed, and referenced only ever in passing, as though the keepers who wrote of it assumed everyone reading already understood what it meant and didn't need it explained. Pressed at the end of his account for what he actually believes is happening at Mount Kailash, whether he thinks the mountain is alive, artificial, haunted, or simply very good at producing altitude sickness and good stories, Lobsang gives an answer stranger than a straightforward yes or no. He says he doesn't think the mountain is doing anything at all in the sense of intention or will. He compares it, instead, to a very old, very deep well. It doesn't reach up and pull you in. It simply exists exactly where it has always existed, and it is the nature of wells that people occasionally fall into them, and that falling into a very deep well changes a person, if it doesn't kill them, in ways that are hard to describe afterward. Whether that's mysticism or simply a very old man's careful, humble way of saying, I don't fully understand it either, Lobsang leaves for the listener to decide. Real places rarely need embellishment to feel extraordinary, and Mount Kailash is a case study in exactly that. Its genuine documented history is already strange enough on its own terms. It stands verifiably as one of the most sacred sites on earth to 4 distinct religious traditions simultaneously: Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Bon, an alignment of devotion almost unmatched anywhere else on the planet. It has never been summited, not because of any confirmed catastrophe, but out of a deep, continuously honored, centuries-old agreement among governments, climbers, and local communities that some places are meant to be circled, not conquered. Four of Asia's great rivers do genuinely originate from the region surrounding it, feeding in one way or another well over 1 billion people downstream. Its near-pyramidal shape is real, striking, and still debated by geologists as either a remarkable natural formation carved by glacial and tectonic forces, or in the more romantic corners of the internet, something else entirely. Stories like Lobsang's persist not because they're documented fact, but because they sit so comfortably atop facts that are already remarkable enough to make the leap feel small. A mountain no one has climbed. A lake that never freezes beside one that never stills. Rivers that begin in one place and sustain half a continent. It doesn't take much imagination to fill in the rest. And for centuries, storytellers, pilgrims, and now filmmakers have done exactly that, each generation adding its own ledger entry to a much older, much longer tradition of wondering what exactly is being protected and from whom. Lobsang Dorje, his monastery, his ledgers, and every event described in this account are fictional, invented for the purposes of this story. They are not a record of real testimony, real expeditions, or real deaths. Mount Kailash's genuine unclimbed status, its religious significance across 4 traditions, its distinctive lake system, and its role as a source for major Asian rivers are real and well documented. Everything else here, the ledgers, the vanishing geologist, the fleeing climber, the failing drones, the room beneath the roots, was written for atmosphere, not evidence. If the real mountain interests you, it rewards a closer, factual look every bit as much as the myth does. Sometimes more.